For everyone that has joined online, we are recording now. And welcome to our March. It's hard to believe it's already March, but our March SCARC meeting. We've got an interesting topic tonight. I think there's been a lot of interest amongst the club members, and certainly a number of emails flying around that I think some folks may not have been fully aware of, and that's related to DXing. And we've got a longtime club member and board member, past board member, and experienced DXer, Bill Meeker, K0KT, who's going to be presenting from his home station about an introduction to DXing and how to get started with it. So, Bill, we'll turn the meeting over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And I'd also like to thanks for inviting me to give this presentation. I was going to give the presentation from my radio room, which is the next room over, but when I tried to log in from my computer there, it wouldn't let me get into Teams. I don't know why. And it was 10 minutes of, and I said, oh, I should just go over and do the presentation here. So this is where I do all my meetings. I do a lot of meetings every week, and Teams and WebEx and all kinds of stuff. Okay, well, I've got a lot of material here. Here's an overview. I'm not going to read this slide. You can just sort of glance at it and see that I do have a lot that I want to talk about. My main goal, however, is to provide sort of a general introduction to DXing for those who don't really know what it is or would like to learn more about it. DXing has probably been the major interest of mine within ham radio since I became licensed a long time ago, 1963. So this is what I'm going to be doing. I'm also going to give a little bit of background about myself and how I got into ham radio and DXing. Not too much, but just a little bit to try and provide some context, because as somebody said recently, it's a path, and it's been a long path for me and others that have been in the game for a long time. So what is DX? Well, there are different definitions. Generally, people think of it as long distance radio communication. So I would say that my best DX on 2 meters was it's either Eastern Pennsylvania or Western New York. I don't remember which one, but that's my best DX on 2 meters. Others would define it as challenging weak signal communication. However that's defined, whatever kind of communications you're trying to do. So if you're talking about 10 gigahertz, you know, DX might be 200 or 300 miles. For the ham bands, the HF bands in particular, typically 160 to 10 meters. DX is usually defined as contacts outside the 48 states. Okay, so there's a number of different, I'll say, goals that we have as DXers, and certainly DXCC is the best known. DX Century Club. It's been around since the 1930s, although after World War II, they started it all over again, tweaked the rules a little bit, and it's been going on continuously since then. What's happened over the years is that the ARRL has extended DXCC, so now there's literally dozens of DXCC awards that one can get. But the basic DXCC is to work 100 entities. In the old days, we called them countries. But then they realized that really wasn't appropriate, because if you look at the list today of entities, there's a lot of things there that wouldn't be considered countries. So I remember when I was working my first few countries back then, I said to my father, oh, I worked a new country today. He said, what was that? I said, Puerto Rico. He said, Puerto Rico's not a country, and neither are a lot of the other things on the list. So we call them entities today. There are also awards for 5-band DXCC. So this has become a thing over the past 30 years. It used to be just count the number of entities you work until the 1960s. And then they started expanding. And so now we've got, as I said, literally dozens of DXCC awards for different bands, for satellite, for different modes, and so forth. The ARRL also has a Worked All Continents award. And sometimes that can be harder than DXCC because you have to work all, I think it's 6 continents. And it took me a long time to get Asia when I first got into this because Asia was difficult from the East Coast. Indeed, my first Asian country was Israel because that's easier. That was a lot easier than Japan. Also, a relatively modern DXCC endeavor that a lot of people participate in is Worked All Zones. So CQ magazine, back a long time ago, probably in the 1950s, divided the world up into 40 zones. And that's a very challenging award because working all 40 zones sort of suggests that you can work any place in the world. So it's not so, some of those zones are hard. And some of them, there's not very many people. I'll come back to that in a moment. Another sort of modern award that's been around for maybe about 20 or 30 years, I'm not sure exactly, is the so-called DX Challenge. The basic idea of DX Challenge is to work band entity combinations. So to, in some sense, work as many different countries on as many different bands as possible. We talk about filling the slots. So I will show you my personal matrix a little bit later where I'm trying to fill in slots. And there's a basic level of entry there to work 100 band entities. A very high level would be 3,000. And there's not many people that have reached 3,000, maybe on the order of hundreds. I don't know exactly. I stand at roughly 2,600 after playing this game for a long, long time. And I can tell you those last 400 are going to be very challenging. I probably won't get to 3,000 unless I get something really efficient going on 6 meters, where I only have 4 entities right now. A big goal for many DXers is the so-called DXCC honor roll, which is being listed in the top 10 numerically on the DXCC list. Right now, you need to have 331 confirmed entities. There are 340 entities on the so-called active list. Then the real pillar of DXCC is number 1 DXCC, where you've worked them all. And here in Story County, we've got 2 who have done that. George, NP2N, a number of years ago, got his last one. And just recently, we heard that Chuck, WA0ROI, worked Crozet, and that was his last one. I was off the air for 12 years. And so I missed 2 entities that came on that have not been on since I got back into the game about 15 years ago. That would be North Korea and an island in near between Taiwan and China called Pratas Island. And that island, I think there's political problems going there because of all the tension between Taiwan and China. So there's not been any activity there recently. I keep hoping that there'll be some way to do that. Here's the CQ zones. I'll just say that we're in zone 4, right in the middle there. Middle of the United States, that is. A very interesting zone, probably the least populated zone among the 40 is zone 2. So look at zone 2 there. That's northern Quebec. There just aren't very many people there. Interestingly, during contests, usually 2 or 3 people drive north and operate in the contest. So it's pretty easy to work zone 2 in the contest bands if you work contests. I don't have zone 2 in any of the work bands because there's just not much daily activity there. The work bands being 12 meters, 17 meters, and 30 meters. Let me just tell you a little bit about my history. I got into DXing doing what's known as broadcast band DXing, listening to AM radio. So I had a big old radio that I pulled out of some garbage, got it running again up in the attic, and we ran a long wire through the eaves. One of the features of the radio was it needed an external antenna. Hooked that up, and I would listen for a long distance broadcast band. I never heard anybody in Europe. Perhaps that could be done today with the better antennas I've got. It's something I want to get back to someday, but you could certainly hear stations from, this is in New Jersey, from Chicago and Miami and places like that. Basically the big so-called clear channel stations running 50 kilowatts. Okay. Then I began shortwave listening in around 1960. I was about 10 years old, and I was a Boy Scout, and I was getting the Boy Scout merit badge, and I built this little super regenerative receiver that was one of the ways you could get there. And that was a real eye-opener for me. I learned a lot about shortwave radio, and I learned about hams because I was listening to hams on 40 and 80 meters. My regenerative receiver didn't tell me what frequency I was listening to, but I heard CQ40 and I heard CQ75. And I remember asking a ham, I said, what's the difference between 80 and 75? Well, 75 is high up in the 80 meter band. And it's only 75 meters, really. Okay, and then I knew I wanted to be a ham. And I studied for a couple of years and got into a class and got my novice in 1963. I built the homebrew little transmitter with a 6L6 final. 6L6 was the only tube, actually. I had an 80 meter crystal, and I had a vertical that I put up, but I didn't know about verticals, and so I didn't have any radials, and it really didn't work. No QSOs with that rig for about 3 months. Then I got a 25 watt rig. Still no verticals on my, still no radios on my vertical, but I made a few 80 meter QSOs, but not very many, and it was hard. Then I ran into a friend at school. I was in high school, freshman, and he was a junior, and he said, oh, you should put up a 40 meter dipole. It'd be a lot better. That's what we all do. So I put up a 40 meter dipole, and that really worked. Not only did it work on 40 meters, but it worked on 15 meters. The rule of multiplying by odd numbers and you get approximate resonance. And it worked really, really well. So only 25 watts out of that rig that I had. And I worked my first real DX on 15 meters as it was just beginning to open as the sunspots were coming back, just like they are now. Subsequently, I put up a 3-element trap tribander at about 20 feet. That didn't work very well. I didn't write it down here, but another friend that I met, he was a senior in college and he was moving his antennas around. He gave me a 3-element monobander for 15 meters. That was a wonderful antenna. It was really heavy. It was homebrew. It was made of steel pipe. We don't do that today. But it worked. It worked really, really well. Then I built myself a linear with a pair of 813s that I bought the parts. I found the thing was half built, and I bought this thing that was half built, and I bought the rest of the parts that I needed and put together the linear. And also convinced my father to help me put up a tower. We put up a 50-foot tower and put up a 4-element 20-meter Yagi. And suddenly I could really work DX. Asia was no longer such a challenge. Okay, that was 1974. I finished school and I moved to Ames, and my next rig was back to 25 watts and a rain gutter. So we were in an apartment in Ames when I first got here, and so that's all I could do. But I got on the air and it worked. It worked rather well. I actually worked a couple of new countries in the Pacific using that rig. We bought a house in 1978 and basically moved my New Jersey station here, the same tower and antenna, and I worked with that until the mid 1990s when I had to take it down for reasons I won't go into. I got back on the air in 2005, and now I'm running full legal. I usually don't turn the amplifier on unless I have to, but I can run full legal limit. I don't like to if I don't have to, just to save wear and tear on the linear, and you don't really need it. And I've got a 4-element tri-bander for 2015 and 10. And I've got a 4-element Yagi on 40. It was always my dream to work on the lower band, so that gave me the opportunity. And I built a 3-element vertical array for 80 meters because the low bands were always sort of my primary goal. It's something I really, really wanted to do. So here's my first DX QSL from DL3LL in Germany. That's the front, and here's the back. So this is the way we used to do QSL cards, postcards, basically. And he just, put the stamp on it, wrote out my address, and so the story behind this QSL, I did this when I was a novice. The novice CW band that we had, I only had one crystal because we had to be crystal controlled. But around the frequency where I could operate on 15 meters, there were European phone stations. They were allowed to go down lower. And I would listen to them and say, gee, I would really like to talk to these people in Europe. And I'd try to call them on CW. They were on phone, I'm on CW. And never worked very well until this fellow came back to me. He switched from phone to CW and answered my call. And I later learned that he was on the DXCC honor roll. He says it right there on his card. And so you can see there WN2, that was my novice call. And so that was a really exciting QSO for me. Here was my station back then. So this is a Drake 2B. Everything I had was very secondhand. So this is basically a 1950s radio, I think. This is an NCX3, 3 being 80, 40, and 20. That's all it covered because they're just trying to figure out how to do single sideband. So that was my first entry into single sideband. And this big thing here on the left, that's my 813 linear. And there was a load and a tune control here. There's the tune control. The load controls, I think, right here. No band switch. If I want to change bands, what I had to do was to shut it off, make sure there was no high voltage inside, and plug in a new coil. So there was a trap door on top of this, and plug in the new coil, and I could go to 80, 20 meters. Okay, and my rotator, that was just a TV antenna rotator. It's about all I could afford, but it worked. And so that was my 1968 or thereabouts. There's my original tower. And here's the vertical antenna that I used. This is the infamous Gotham V80 vertical. They had all this marketing to say what a wonderful DX antenna it was and all the things that this one fellow had done with it. So I bought it hook, line, and sinker, put it up, but never really worked. And it is this, I believe, I've heard that it is this antenna, and it's, I won't say popularity, other than a lot of people bought them, that said not only are verticals omnidirectional, which is, a nice feature, but they radiate equally poorly in all directions. So I was a little bit down on verticals until in 1978, I purchased a copy of this book by ON4UN. And I read it cover to cover several times and dreaming about a gain antenna for 80 meters. And he also showed what you need to do to have good receive. Well, as I said, one of my passions in ham radio has been low band DXing. Um, we could have a whole conversation about that, but I'm going to just say a few things about it. ON4UN went on to publish uh, not only that original pamphlet in 1978, but 5 editions of his low band DXing book. And I think I own 3 of the 5. A lot of information there. If you're interested in low band DXing, you have to get a copy of one of those books. If you want one cheap, I probably would be willing to part with a couple of the ones that I've got. Okay, to do DXing, the basic equipment you need, of course, is a radio and an antenna. For 1960, we always had separate transmitters and receivers. Well, my transceiver, that NCX3 was a transceiver. That was the first transceiver I had. I had other stuff before that, but I had a separate receiver there. And the separate receiver was important because in doing DX, you often have to be able to receive off of your transmitting frequency. Most modern transceivers provide 100 watts output. There are a few that provide 200 watts. Most modern rigs cover 160 to 6 meters. Some of them go up to 2 meters or even higher. 2 VFOs are very useful. Even better than 2 VFOs is 2 receivers. So the high-end transceivers today actually have 2 separate receivers. So you can simultaneously be receiving on 2 different frequencies. That can be very useful. I use that feature all of the time. Pan adapters and band scopes are becoming very popular. And again, in the high-end radios, they're built in. The secondhand market, I think, can provide excellent economic value. The old radios perform pretty darn well. Indeed, my radios are old radios. People who know me know that I tend to use old stuff. My automobile that I drive is 23 years old. My radio computer is, I have to stop and count, 14 years old. I've got one that's only 10 years old that I'm going to replace it with someday. And indeed, the computer I'm using here at my desk that I use for work is 6 years old now. Anyway, both of my radios are pretty old. I was using my 1980s radio first, but then I really wanted a radio that would talk to the computer. That's pretty useful today. So in 2005, I bought an Orion 2, and that's my backup radio today. A few years later, I bought a K3. And a few years after that, I bought the pan adapter that came out for the K3. So I'm still using that. So K3 is probably a 12 or 13-year-old radio. Those are beginning to come on the market now because now there's a K4. I really haven't felt the need for a K4. So I think there's a lot of value there in the secondhand market. Many DXers have a linear amplifier for more power. The big debate has been over the last 10 years, tubes or solid state. There's advantages of both. I've got one of each now. I was always a big fan of tube radios because of their stability and full power, whereas a lot of the solid state ones would only run 900 watts or 1,000 watts and wouldn't do very well on continuous operation modes like RIDI and FT8. They just get too hot. Indeed, I don't like to run my solid state one on FT8. FT4 is okay, but FT8, it just gets too hot for me. So I'm a reliability guy. Professionally, in my professional job for the last 40 years, I've worked in product and system reliability. So I think about these things a lot. And heat is the enemy of reliability in electronic equipment. Okay, basic equipment, antennas. Antennas are very important. You can work with compromise antennas, but it's a lot easier if you've got, as I learned early on, that vertical didn't do very well. Putting up a Yagi made all the difference in the world because you get directivity, which means you can point at what you want to work and you don't hear interference from other places, plus you get gain. And so I find it very useful. Typically, it's useful also to get that Yagi pretty high up in the air. The rough guideline is you want to get it one wavelength up at least, and that's for angle of radiation. Generally for DX, for long distance, we have low angles of radiation, as I'll show you in a picture in a little while. Most people for 80 to 30 meters use dipoles or inverted Vs because Yagis are just too big. Or vertical arrays. Verticals are very effective, I've learned, but you need to use some kind of ground system, usually radials. And so in my so-called antenna field where I have my vertical antennas, I spent a summer putting down radials, 5 miles of copper wire. And it made a difference. It really improves the efficiency of your vertical antennas. Okay, non-resonant antennas of various types can be useful. One very popular antenna is a just some sort of a doublet fed with open wire and then matched with some kind of a tuning device to your 50 ohms that your radios like to see. They're also effective multi-band antennas, but you do need an antenna tuner. And it's best if the tuner is close to the antenna, or if the antenna is fed with open wire feeders that has very low loss at high SWR. In putting up antennas, you have to worry about antenna restrictions. And there's all kinds of restrictions that can arise. City and county ordinances. I know that Ames has a restriction that you can't put an antenna up more than, I don't remember how many feet. I'm sure that Ron and Skip could tell me because they probably had to stay within that limit. Another is common covenants and restrictions. So when you buy a house, you go and look carefully at the deed. If that house was built after about 1975, you have some pretty strict, you may well almost certainly have some pretty strict restrictions according to these covenants. The house that we first moved into was the subdivision, it was 1978, but the fellow who did the subdivision went to an old time lawyer who just took some boilerplate things and used it. It didn't have that stuff that you see all the time now. A lot of places have homeowner association restrictions, and then sometimes spousal objections. And so Karen, for example, didn't want any guys in our lawn, so I had to deal with that with a kind of compromise. It could be a whole nother story, but when I went to put up the antennas here at our new residence in 2005, I had to jump through a lot of hoops. And I ran into some speed bumps along the way, but I got some very good legal help. And with that legal help, I was able to get my building permit, put everything up completely legally. I can remember I told the story about the problems I was having at a SCARC club early on, and one of the members said, "Just put it up." To which my lawyer said, "Absolutely not." And one of my lawyers was Fred Hoppengarten. Fred is a telecommunications lawyer, and he published this book. Well, the ARL published the book. He wrote the book, and so that was basically my guide. And Fred sort of guided me through the whole process. And sure enough, I submitted my application. 2 weeks later, I had my building permit. QSLs are very important in DXing. You saw my early QSL that I showed you from DL3LL. I've got a lot of those old-fashioned cards. I'm still getting them. I've got 14 shoe boxes full of them here. Most of them came in through the so-called bureau that I'll mention in a moment. How do we get DX cards? Well, it used to be the best case scenario was that the DX had a manager dedicated to getting those QSLs out, and you'd send the manager QSL and return postage, and you'd get your card. Today, it's usually via some kind of online request. So I do, most of it's done through something called Club Log, but there are alternatives where you go to a web page and enter some information about your QSOs, request the QSLs, and make a payment of maybe something between $3 and $5 for the return postage. And that's a lot less expensive than having to send a QSL to some resident ham in some country along with return postage. So it's very convenient. The worst case is when you have to go via direct mail, and I avoid doing that. Sometimes it's the only alternative. And I remember when I worked a station in Mongolia, so Dave W0FLS, who's out west of, well, a bit southwest of here. Dave and I worked Mongolia on 160 meters. That was like, wow, at the same morning. And I got in touch with Dave and I said, I'll tell you what, Dave, you know, the only way to get a card from this guy in Mongolia where, you know, is registered mail. I said, let's do it together. I'll send me a card and I'll send it to him and he'll return both to me and I'll get the card to you. Because registered mail costs, I don't know, $15 or something. So that's the way we got that card. But I don't like to do that. It's just too complicated. The modern way of doing QSLing, see, when we work band country, most of us want to get a confirmation. The QSL is the confirmation. And you need it for a lot of awards like DXCC. You have to have a confirmation. Well, ARRL about 20 years ago started up LOTW, Logbook of the World. It's all virtual now. And most DXers participate. And there's been an increasing trend. The folklore is that people on FT8 tend to use LOTW more, but I'm beginning to doubt that. Maybe it's a slightly better proportion, but there's still a lot of DX stations out there where I work them and I want a QSL, but they won't do LOTW. In fact, now I'm looking them up before I call them to see if they're on LOTW. And if they're not, I just don't bother. Because I don't want that, because there's alternatives and I don't want the hassle. If there's no alternatives like Mongolia, then you have to go the hard route. Almost all serious contesters use LOTW. All serious DXpeditions use LOTW. In fact, to get funding from most of the clubs, they require that you say, I will do LOTW. Often the DXpeditions will delay the upload of LOTW unless you contributed to the DXpedition, usually 6 months or something like that, which is acceptable for most people. There's also something called EQSL that I don't understand, but it's not used for, it's maybe used for some awards, but certainly not DXCC. Record keeping is important. There's lots of ways to do this. Everybody has their own way. There's many alternatives. But two things that you need to do in DX record keeping is your time has to be in UTC. which we used to call Greenwich Mean Time. And sometimes we just use the abbreviation Z, which stands for Zulu. That comes from military use of the common time zone. Another thing is always spell out the month. So write 2 March 2023, because if you do 2/3/23, that's ambiguous. In almost every other country in the world, they change the order from what we typically do here in the United States. So I learned very early on, for all purposes, to write out the month. Plus, it's a lot easier to read. So electronic software and databases and cloud services have largely replaced paper for record keeping. So you need to have a logbook, and then there's various cloud type things for your logs as well. So LOTW is one. So I can go to LOTW and I can download an ADIF file that contains all of my QSOs that I've ever made. So it's a kind of record. But for redundancy and convenience, I use a logging software as well. And there's lots of them available. I happen to really like Logger 32. It's free, very general, and does lots of cool stuff. I know there's lots of other alternatives that also do very cool stuff that might even be better. But again, I'm one of these people. Once I get locked into something, I stay with it unless there's a good reason to change. Just like my old car and my old radios. I regularly back up my log to an ADIF file. Indeed, every time I work a new band country, I just click, and make a backup of my log. Just in case, the computer is old and someday that hard drive is going to fail. Club log is something else that's become very popular among especially DXers. It's a complement to LOTW. It does lots of things. One thing is the OQRS system, online QSL requests, that I don't think I mentioned, but it was on the previous slide. If you upload your log to Club Log, when you go to request QSLs via this system, you do not have to enter any information because it's there. And moreover, it will tell you immediately that there's a match. You can tell you're in the log at the right time. And indeed, I had a case not too long ago in January with the station that was on from Congo, where I went to put in my QSOs and I didn't have a match on my 160 meter QSO, the most important one, the one I really needed. So what was it? So Club Log told me that. And then I went back and investigated, and this was my beginning of the use of a particular piece of software for FT8. And what happened was that the way it was set up was that the beginning of the QSO was the first time I called them. Of course, I didn't work them on the first call. I had to call them for a long time, and I worked them at the end. And I guess that LOTW, or at least Club Log, was keying on the beginning time. So I just had to go in to log and adjust the time so that the beginning, and now the software is set up to do that automatically. It should have been that way to begin with. So basically, my beginning and ending time of all my QSOs are the same, which is approximately accurate because most of my QSOs are short. Okay. So this is another piece of record keeping that I use. It's an Excel spreadsheet that I maintain that has a matrix where the different rows on the left-hand side are the different entities. You can see it still says country there. So I put this together about 12 years ago. And then the columns are the different bands and different modes. And so in the old days, starting in the 1950s, there were only 2 DXCC awards, mixed and phone. There was no CW award. Why not? Well, you ask, well, why was there a separate phone award? Well, the reason is that phone DX was hard back then. DXers were almost always focused on CW because that's what you needed for weak signal communication. And phone meant AM, not nearly as efficient as CW. That all changed when single sideband came in the well, it came in progressively throughout the 50s. By the end of the 1950s, 20 meters was all single sideband. There was still a lot of AM on 15 because that's where I was. And I was doing AM for the first couple of years I was on phone because it's all I could afford. I built my own modulator and used it with my 25-watt rig. Anyway, now we've got all these different DXCC awards that we can get. And here's my LOTW record a couple months ago, for all the different bands, and I can drill down and I can see who was the QSL, who was the station that I worked on that particular slot, as we call them. Yeah, so when we look at this, we call these slots, and you can see the white ones are empty ones. Those are ones I haven't worked. The yellow ones are ones that where I've worked them but haven't got a QSL. And all the other ones are ones where I'm confirmed, either with a card or with LOTW. So the color coding tells me what kind of confirmation I've got. Another recommendation I have is that when you work a station that's fairly rare and it's going to be hard to work them again, get that QSL, get that confirmation, however you do it, as quickly as possible. I've got 2 really great QSOs in my log where I now know I will never get them confirmed. The logs are gone because I waited too long. In one case, I waited 20 years. In the other case, I waited 12 years. And so anyway, I've learned my lesson. I'm much more careful now. The expeditions are a very important part of DX. We had about 2 years off from DXpeditions during the whole COVID area, but they've really come back in full force, as we've seen in recently. So the modern DXpeditions are usually multi-operator, multi-station with a large team, and they're usually going to very rare or super rare entities. So we've heard about Bouvet. Bouvet was a bit of a bust because, well, I won't go into it. I have my own thoughts on what happened there, but they had all this hype on their webpage that they were what they were going to do, and they didn't do it. And so it was a big disappointment for a lot of people, particularly those who needed Bouvet for a new country. I didn't. I had worked them back in the late 1980s when there was a big DXpedition that went there. And that DXpedition, they did it much differently. Instead of going in a sailboat, they went in a big ship and they moved everything to a high part of the island using a helicopter. That's the way these South Atlantic island DXpeditions are often done because it's safe and it's effective, but it's very expensive. And what they usually have to do is sort of team up with a scientific team that can help with the funding. But the people who went to Bouvet didn't do that. They thought they could do it in a sailboat. And obviously, it didn't work out for a variety of reasons. Some DXpeditions are just 1 or 2 operators go someplace, and that can be very effective too. And then there's the holiday, so-called holiday style DXpedition, where somebody just takes some radio when they go on vacation. Generally low power and QRP, but you can still work some good DX, and some of them do a very good job with those because they are a little more careful with the antennas they put up and spend more time doing it. You can read about the announced DXpeditions going to this web page here. It lists all the ones that are currently active and the ones that have been announced, so you can sort of keep up on things. There is a long interesting history of famous DXpedition operators when all this stuff got started in the 50s and the 60s. And in the 50s and 60s, there's usually one or two people doing it. They didn't have these big teams. The first big team one that I remember was actually when it was about 1965, when a big team went to a brand new entity called San Felix Island. And that was a team of about 6, if I recall correctly. But usually it was these small things where one or two people would go. And I've listed some names down here. There's plenty of information about these on the internet if you're interested in reading about the history. And there's books that have been written on this on these subjects as well. I'll point you to one of the books in a little while because it's available for free now. Dick McKirchner was a very well-known DXer from Iowa. He lived in Rippey. And indeed, the superstation of N0NI is on the farm where Dick had his station. So here's the so-called honor roll. It used to appear in QST, I think maybe once a year. And I'm going to zoom in on the honor roll part of that, because down here they list the people who, what they listed everybody, I think, in a sequence of pages who was a member of DXCC and their count. And if you're in the top 10 count, you're here. So here I'm zooming in. So here's W0MLY from Rippey. He was pretty high up on the list. Here's my first DX contact, DL3LL. And I highlight W2FZY. W2FZY, they used to call him Fuzzy. He lived less than a mile away from me. And whenever he came on the air, I knew it. No matter what band he was on and band I was on, I knew he was on the air. That was how good the selectivity of our receivers were back then, at least my receiver. And then I go find him because he always had interesting things to say about DX. And then I also highlighted down here 4x4DK. 4x4DK is today at the top of the honor roll. I think probably one of the few people on this list who's still alive. The only one that I know who's still alive anyway. Okay. Operator skills are really important. Good operator skills can make up for not having a loud signal. Indeed, it's important. Now, if you've got a loud signal, you maybe don't need good operator skills, but people will look at what you're doing and call you a lid if you're not careful. So good operator skills is important. Situational awareness is important. If you hear a station you want to work, don't just jump in and start calling. Listen, trying to figure out what's going on in and around the frequency. How is he operating? Where is he listening? This is essential. And operators with low power learn these rules very easily. The high power person just goes in there and tries to blast their way through. May get through, but probably not in the most efficient way. Propagation, knowledge of propagation is extremely important for DXers. So Chuck gave a very nice presentation several years ago, I recall, on propagation. Maybe you can twist his arm to come back and do it again. I'm going to talk a little bit about propagation here, but just hit a couple of the highlights. There's a lot of information available on the internet. The old saying is in DX, you have to listen, listen, listen. And if you're doing FT8, it's watch, watch, watch. You really need to pay attention to what is going on, how the operator is working. On FT8, I was calling somebody today. I learned a lesson. I was calling somebody today and he was really strong. And finally, I turned my amplifier on because after 20 minutes, he wasn't coming back to me. So this is the St. Brandon DXpedition. And the reason he wasn't was that I didn't pay enough attention. It turned out that he was doing FT8, and usually the operators are listening way up the band, up all the way up to 2,000, 2,500, 3,000. He wasn't doing that. He had a filter on. And it wasn't until I started watching and saying, who is he working and where are they calling? Now, I've always known how to do that in sideband and CW, but in FT8, I thought you had this whole band. But no, he was for some reason being very restrictive. And once I realized where I need to put my transmit signal, bingo, I had him, and I still had my amplifier on, and I was embarrassed that he gave me a plus 25 dB, which I certainly didn't need. Okay. How is the DX operator handling the pileup? Pileup means a lot of stations calling on one frequency. And it's just funny to listen to those, both on phone and on CW. Usually they spread them out. And if it's just a moderately rare DX, they'll spread them out maybe 4 or 5 kilohertz. But if it's a brand new DXpedition, you'll see them sometimes going 20, 30, 40 kilohertz, which is really crazy. They shouldn't need to do that. It's a waste of spectrum. And people get angry when they do it. But sometimes there's so many stations that's what happens. The station just keeps on tuning up and up and up. And that's what you need to know. What's the pattern that the operator is using to answer calls? I didn't stick it in here, but the so-called skimmer works very well as a tool for helping to see where the person is calling. But frankly, unless it's a very widespread, I like the old-fashioned way. I open up my receiver. So I've got two receivers. One, I'm listening to the DX, and I use a very tight filter there. But then I use a very wide filter for my other receiver, so I can hear, 20 stations at one time, looking for the one that just worked him. And then I know roughly where to call. Roughly, I say, because usually you don't want to call him on exactly the same frequency that he was working. You want to go whatever direction that the operator is tuning. One of the things I've seen about sideband operators that I learned, they say 5 to 10 up, 5 to 10 up, and you think it's anywhere in that range of 5 kilohertz, right? No, often what they do is they go 5 up and then they do 10 up. And when 10 up gets too crowded, they go back to 5 up. So once you learn that pattern, it's pretty easy to flip as soon as they flip, especially if you've got two receivers. Okay, timing is extremely important in getting through a pileup. Of course, it's essential in the FT modes, FT8 and FT4. You have to have the right timing, or you won't. They won't decode you. But it's also important in sideband and CW. Study the operating habits. So if I want to work a particular station, like I've been chasing this station in Nepal recently, because 10 meters open up and I need Nepal on 10 meters and 12 meters. And so once I knew it was feasible to work him, I started studying what he was doing, and he was coming on early hour morning, like 6 in the morning, but the band wasn't opening. And so I was being a little bit frustrated for a few weeks. But suddenly, actually this morning, I was able to work him. This is the first morning I was able to, no, I think I coded him one time earlier this week. And this morning I could decode him consistently because 10 meters, 10 meters was really good this morning. But study the operating habits. What days of the week does the person come on if he's a resident? Another little thing that I learned early on was that the weekend in Muslim countries is Friday and Saturday. That's helpful to know when is the best time to be looking for a station in one of those countries. Today we have spotting history. And I learn a lot by going and looking at the spotting history. So I've been chasing another station in Sri Lanka. And he works FT8 on 30 and 40, usually 30. I've worked him on 30 because he's there a lot, but once in a while on 40, I'm trying to understand his pattern. When does he go on 40? What time? and hopefully I'll catch them there someday. But there are bad actors out there. There are pirates. Pirate is somebody who pretends to be rare DX, but they're not. And yeah, they're just bad actors. The other is DQRM. And DQRM is especially a problem when you've got weak signals and lots of people, lots of demand. And so it was a really serious issue with Bouvet because they were always weak here because they had low power wire antennas on the wrong side of the island. And the DQRMers would just come on and make it impossible. Now, what they often did was to move from CW to FT8. I think the DQRMers have a bit more trouble because one carrier won't kill the station. But I can tell you a carrier does seem to degrade the ability to decode. So they can still be a problem. But I don't see too much DQRM on FT8 in my limited experience of the last month or so. I just got back on FT8 a month ago, doing it for Crozet and Bouvet was the reason that I expedited that. Read the DX code of conduct. DX code of conduct. I'm not going to read through this. You can find it on the internet. It's well publicized. This is for people trying to work DX, and then there's a similar one for DXers to use that they should follow, because sometimes DXers aren't very experienced. They don't know what to do. Here's another cute modern technology that was being used by the TN8K DXpedition in January. This is called live streaming, and it's hosted by Clublog. So basically, you hook your logging system directly to Clublog, so you're uploading QSOs as they're being made, which anybody can do. And then Clublog runs this web page where you can see the active bands, the ones in green here on top. And you can also see the stations that worked him recently, what part of the world for these. What you can't distinguish is what stations on what bands by looking at the colors, however. But you do have this list, so you can see the last, I don't know, 40 or so stations that the DX station had worked. And I'm about 6 or 7 down. K0 KT worked on 20 meters. So after I worked on my, another thing I like to do is to take screenshots of my FT8 or this and save them as sort of proof that I was in the log, or should be in the log. Okay, I'm running out of time. Let me say a few words about radio propagation because of how important it is. There's lots you can study, lots on the internet. There are whole books that have been written on the subject, lots of articles on the internet. Basically, what you need to do is you need to, going down to my 4th bullet point, is you need to understand the cycles and the periodicities and their interactions. So the cycles would be the sunspot cycle. The periodicities would be what happens over a year. Conditions are a lot different in the summer than they are around this time of year. And there's periodicities within a day. And it's all very complicated because the way these things interact are very different when there's a lot of sunspots versus a very small number of sunspots. A good introduction to this would be in the ARRL handbook. They have a chapter where they go through band by band, explaining how the bands work. We've also got some wonderful tools to help us understand propagation. So there's a typo here. It's not vocap, it's VOACAP, short for Voice of America. I've forgotten exactly what CAP stands for, but basically it's propagation. and it's a very useful tool. DX Atlas is my favorite tool to visualize the seasonal and diurnal effects of of where there's light and where there's not. So here's just a picture to illustrate radio wave propagation. We've got different layers. Many of you have been around field day when there was sporadic E propagation, and that's relatively short skip, typically something like 1,000 miles. The longer DX comes from the F region. And so propagation is always all about reflection and absorbing. If things are being absorbed up there, nothing's coming back to Earth. If you get good reflection, you get good DX. And here's a little picture for why low angles are important. If the station's coming from a long ways off, then they're more likely to be coming in at low angles. And so the different periodicities I talk about control when things are reflecting and when things are absorbing. And that controls propagation in a nutshell. I can't go through the details, it just isn't time. But here's a plot of past sunspot cycles. So the one here that peaked in 1959, that was a huge one. The old timers talk about that. That was before my day, a few years before I got on the air. Everybody's waiting for that to happen again. Whenever there's a peak that big or close, there often is worldwide F-skip 6-meter propagation, just like we're seeing in 10 meters now. But if the SFI gets considerably higher than 200, you can begin to see F on 6 meters. They've already seen it this cycle, but probably not so much up this far north. And here's just another picture of some predictions that had been made about what was going to happen last time. The prediction of sunspot peaks is not so well developed because there's a lot of uncertainty. They've been studying this. There's a lot of scientists still studying it, but the scientists have different models and the different models have different predictions. So this is a VOACAP. I got it right here. This is a VOACAP interface. It's a very complicated interface at one level. To run VOACAP, basically you need to say transmitter, antenna, power, location, and then receiver, transmitter, antenna, not transmitter, antenna, and location. And specifying all that's very complicated, but you can do it, and then basically what you get is a probability of success. There's a simpler way to do it. And so as I said, I've been looking for Nepal on 10 meters. So if I go to the web interface giving me spots, the so-called DX Summit, and if I right click and ask for VOACAP, this is what I get. Now I'm looking for 10 meters. 10 meters is out here on the so-called VOACAP circle. So it doesn't look very good. I mean, the probability is only about 10% here. Now, this is under basic. Basic is basically 100 watts in wires, wire antenna or no gain antennas or something like that. However, this is for short path. Short path would be pointing over the North Pole to Nepal. However, so that's my only chance. However, if I go long path, so I just change this little slider down here in the bottom left that says long path, then I see, wow, I'm up to 60%. Big difference. but I have to remember to point my antenna south. And then I have to hope that he's pointing in the same direction if he has a directional antenna. Now, this was done when the sunspot number was 131. I don't know what it is today. It was about that. And so now I've got a good chance. I sent this out in an email to the club, but I'll review it. Another strategy is pick the best time of day, especially for a DXpedition. If you go in when you're competing to crozet with Europe, you're not going to make it because they've got much better propagation than you do. So here is crozet to Ames, and then I could change some settings on my interface, and I get crozet to Italy. See how much better they are here? So even though there's a good chance to work them around here, you're not going to do it because Italy's got a much better chance. However, around 2 or 3 Zulu, you can see that now Ames has the propagation and Italy doesn't. We're better than them, not to mention most of them are asleep. So that's when most of North Americans were successful in working crozet. I'm still hoping to get them on 10 meters. So you can see there's a little bit of a chance of getting on 10 meters here in the morning. So far, I've not even heard them. Although the spots today said they were on single sideband and they weren't busy. So maybe that's what I've got to do. Okay, other tool is the Beacon project that we actually had a program on this a few years ago. But basically there are 18 stations around the world and they cycle through. And if you go to a particular frequency, you can listen for all these and you can see where the band is open to. DXedge was a tool that I used for many, many years. So this is a map of the world, and then you can see this plastic slider. And the plastic slider, I had one for each month. This one's for April. And I've got one for every other month. You just change it out at the beginning of or the middle of every month. But today we do all this in software. And this is DX Atlas. And so this is the winter solstice, December 21. And we can see a very different pattern today. That has a big effect on propagation. And this is St. Brandon, where we're trying to get today. And I just made this one yesterday. Okay, so I know I'm running out of time, and I know there's a time limit there. So I think I'm just going to say that, okay, which band should I use? It depends. It depends on all that stuff. But generally, 160, 80, and 40 are nighttime bands. 15, 10, 12 are daytime bands. And 20, it depends on whether there's sunspots or not. But it's, there's a continuum here. So that's why it's complicated. But that's the simple way of thinking about it. The key thing in propagation is to look at the maximum usable frequency. I used to know or have available a very nice website that was very good about this, but it disappeared. And this is the best that I could find. Someday I'll go looking to see if I can do better. And so this is a map that's updated continuously. And the basic idea is that you get the most efficient propagation if you're close to the maximum usable frequency, if that maximum usable frequency applies for the whole path. And so by looking at a map like this, you can see if the band's going to open or not. DX information is important. In the early days, we used to use the telephone, and then there were DX bulletins that were mailed out in the 1960s. I still subscribe to one of them, except it comes via email every day now instead of every week. And The Eastern Iowa DX Association has a web. They have a bulletin that they send out once a week to members. But you can just go to this URL and read it for free. I didn't know about the Eastern Iowa DX Association until I started doing research for this presentation, and I learned about it, and I've since joined. There's a lot. They've got a lot of members out there. And then here's, I think I put this up before, the announced DXpeditions. So here's the DX Summit that I use. There are, I believe there's others. That is, there are other interfaces that give you the spots. You can send your own spot on the right-hand side here, and you can filter. So I use filtering a lot. I say, I want to see when my target station in Sri Lanka is on 40 meters. And I can look and see all the spots that he's gotten on 40 meters. One thing I've noticed, however, is a lot of times there'll be DX on, particularly on FT8, where they won't get spotted, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. Usually if rare DX gets spotted, the crazies come in, the DQRMers. So anyway, good and bad. And here's where I'm getting to my interface to VOACAP. I like to use DX contests to get started. I'm not, I do contests, but I'm not really a contester. I'm a DXer. But I've always used contests to fill up slots, to get new countries. And it's the way I learned CW. It's the way I learned to be proficient in CW. So DX clubs and organizations, I've mentioned the Eastern Iowa DX Association. I'm also a member of the Twin Cities DX Association. So they have newsletters. Perhaps the biggest benefit of being a member is you get on their mailing list. And the protocol usually is to send a note to your club before you spot them. So the club members, so I get these emails from time to time, and I picked up a bunch of new rare entities by knowing that they were on because one of the club members told the other members. And then there's some national and international associations as well. YASME is a big international one. And I'll just mention there is this book that was published by the ARRL. And this is the one that gives the story about the early DXpeditions in the 1950s and 1960s, including Dick McKercher's DXpeditions. He used to go to Africa on business, and so he did a lot of DXpeditioning himself. I don't know who he got to run his station when he was over there. Concluding remarks, DXing is not for everybody, but many enjoy the challenges involved. I certainly do. DXing and contesting are different, but they often complement each other. Many DXers enjoy the engineering challenge of station building and improving, or as they say, how can I get another 3 dB? QRP DX is possible, a lot of people do it, but operator skill and good antennas is more or less essential. And knowledge of propagation is certainly helpful as well. FT8 has been a game changer in DX. Why? Because now operators with low power and wires can really work DX effectively. I mentioned in an email that Jeff K0JSB has been very successful with his attic antenna and 100 watts. And it would not have been possible on single sideband. Some DXers take things too seriously. I like to keep it light. We should participate in these activities because we're having fun. It's really a hobby. Well, thank you for your attention. I'm sorry I took so much time, but hope you learned something useful. And I'm sure Paul figured out a way to make my slides available to you.
No, thanks, Bill. We'll work to get those online. I appreciate your presentation. Join me in thanking Bill for his time here.